Well, hello everybody. As you just heard, am Kyhl Stephen. I'm coming from Cornell University. I'm delighted to be here. I want to say before I begin what an absolute honor it is to be here and to be ending this panel. I feel like as a graduate student, I've been sort of admiring and aware of the work of my co-panelists, and it's kind of surreal to be presenting after all of them now. You know, I feel a little like me, really, you know, like a little kid in a big floppy suit. So I'll also say before I begin that last year I came through Quarry Farm on a fellowship to investigate the role of Mark Twain in solidifying corporate personhood as a lived phenomenon, at least in a sort of philosophically pragmatist sense. And the talk that I'll share today is sort of like the leftovers of that project, as it was a little more focused. These are the things that didn't quite fit into the chapter, but that seemed to fit importantly into how we can think about Twain's economic activity. So I'll admit that in doing this, I've sort of ham-fisted a lot of material that was meant for something else into being about humor, which is to say, first of all, that humor is not really my forte. Is not something I have a specialty in. So to anybody who is an expert in the room, I apologize for sounding like a dilettante. It's because I am a dilettante deep in my heart. And so if nothing else, I thank you for the opportunity to try on yet another new hat. So with the throat clearing out of the way, the central claim that I'd like to make today, this morning, is that Mark Twain's humor played an important role in the closing decades of the 19th century in, as I say, fashioning consumer society. And I have chosen this word kind of intentionally, in part just because after the last like 20 years of titling conventions, where every other historical essay or monograph or whatever is the making of X, it feels kind of gauche to call something the making of X. So in one sense, fashioning just means making, but without having to say making. So by that, what I mean is that Twain is, by saying that Twain is making consumer society, what we mean is that he's training otherwise ordinary people to think of themselves first and foremost as consumers, right? Obviously, this is a much bigger phenomenon than we can lay at the feet of Mark Twain. It is both much older and involves much more profound transformations in political and economic landscapes. Mark Twain did very interesting work in the context of the Second Industrial Revolution, but of course he did not cause the Second Industrial Revolution. But this qualification leads very nicely into the second and I think more precise valence of fashioning that I mean, which is, I think, more literally in the sense of fashion or style. Or more precisely, of adopting a particular style or fashion through consumption. So it would be probably a stretch to say that categorically Twain turned people into consumers, but I think it would be much more appropriate and plausible to argue that Twain helped to shape people's understandings of what it means to be a consumer in the first place. Of what it means for you or me as individuals to exhibit particular modes of consumption. So what happens when we consume in a particular way, right? And I mean to suggest in the course of this talk that one of the functions of Mark Twain's writing was to help people understand consumption as political or class performance, of course, obviously, yes, but more precisely and to the point today, as interpersonal and affective intercourse. So the humor of this writing, I propose, is a key ingredient of this re-signification of consumption. So for the rest of my talk, I'll focus on The Innocents Abroad, in part, to be frank, simply because it's one of the things that I read while I was here a year ago, but also in part because it offers good illustrations of the multiple overlapping dimensions of Twain's humor, as well as some of the interesting afterlives, some of its interesting afterlives in consumer culture. So that's in part to say that I'm still a little bit in the hypothesis phase. So if this resonates with other instances of Twain's work that you can think of, I'd love to hear about it. I'm eager to know where to look next. And at the same time, equivalently, if this all sounds bunk, please tell me that too, so that I don't waste more time on it. So I'll look at some conventional approaches to Twain's humor and sort of think about some of the challenges of navigating the politics of Twain's humor, and use that as a segue for thinking about Twain's humor as more performatively functional, right? Twain's humor is doing something. I'll emphasize the aspect of consumption that is almost always present in Twain's work, and I'll ask what it means to put these facts together to consume humor. So again, stressing that I'm not an expert in the study of humor, my understanding is that it's a pretty conventional move to think of humor as a kind of commentary derived from an observed disjunction between the world as it is and the world as it ought to be. But of course, this sort of definition depends heavily on the parameters of context and the joking subject. It relies a lot on a shared assessment between you and me and whoever our author is of indeed how the world ought to be. Perhaps it is for this reason that, at least in my brief perusal of the literary study of humor, nothing like a consensus seems to emerge. Sometimes humor is necessarily a call for reform, and indeed, Twain's humor was often read by his contemporaries in this way, among them most famously probably William Dean Howells, but as some critics have argued, there was a kind of an appreciation for the sort of realist or political dimensions of Twain's humor since he began publishing, all along. Others, however, have argued almost exactly to the contrary, that humor serves especially as a tool for keeping the world as it is. It naturalizes prevailing social structures and power relations, silencing critique through rhetoric rather than argument. At the far end of the spectrum might be Horkheimer, Adorno, and the Frankfurt Schoolers, for whom humor is yet another instance of the determination of everyday life and subjectivity by capital and the cultural industry. And yet, at the opposite extreme, some scholars have argued that humor is a means literally of subjective liberation within capitalist context, right? So like what it does, who can say, right? Nobody ever seems to know. So my point in presenting again, to my dilettante eyes, fragmented state of the state of humor studies is not to discount it so much as to illustrate how the meaning and impact of humor can vary, even within the space of just one work. So just in The Innocents Abroad, Twain flips back and forth between humor as a kind of reformer criticism and humor as a sort of a tool of a kind of reactionary goon. So take, for instance, an encounter that he and his companions have with the painting of saints by Italy's old masters. I love this little thing. I'll read this, or part of it. But humble as we are and unpretending in the matter of art, our researches among the painted monks and martyrs have not been wholly in vain. We have striven hard to learn. We've had some success. We have mastered some things, possibly of trifling import to the eyes of the learned, but to us they give us pleasure. And we take as much pride in our little acquirements as do others who have learned far more, and we love to display them full as well. We see a monk going about with a lion looking tranquilly up at heaven, and we know that is St. Mark. We see a monk with a book and a pen looking tranquilly up at heaven, trying to think of a word, and we know that is St. Matthew. We see a monk sitting on a rock looking tranquilly up at heaven, with a human skull beside him and without other baggage. We know that is St. Jerome, because we know that he always went flying light in the matter of baggage. We see a party looking tranquilly up at heaven, unconscious that his body is shot through with arrows, and we know that is St. Sebastian. We see other monks looking tranquilly up at heaven, but having no trademark. We always ask who those parties are. We do this because humbly we wish to learn. So this particular instance of Twain humor I propose is a pretty good example of the reformer critic. On one hand, the scene is an instance of the kind of irreverent throwing off of old world sensibilities and priorities that characterizes so much of the book, but it is in equal measure critical of the habit of reducing spirituality and aesthetics and aesthetic beauty to commerce that the scene seems to attribute to Americans. To the crass gang of Americans, the saints are recognizable only through their trademarks, through a kind of brand association. The saints of the great works of Western art are effectively all laid out on a shelf, differentiated not by what they are, because of course they're all the same thing. They're all tranquilly looking up at heaven, but by the associations to which they are reducible. Catholic spirituality is collapsed into that which is merely consumable. So here is Twain in his humor as the critic of capitalism at the very cusp of the Gilded Age. At other times, however, the politics of Twain's humor is decidedly more regressive. When, for example, he describes the people of the Azores or the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, or for heaven's sake, the entire Muslim faith, his humor is, to say the least, extremely distasteful. So in instances like these, the discursive impact of Twain's humor seems less interested in critique than solidifying what already is, in hardening formulations of modernity and Americanness through contrast with racialized groups dismissed rhetorically as inferior. But my interest in Twain's humor stems rather less from the often self-contradictory politics or even its discursive impact generally. And instead, what is of interest to me is the kind of relationship that Twain's humor posits between the writer and its audience. Consider another example from the middle of The Innocents Abroad during his visit to Italy, as Twain and his companions terrorize tour guides up and down the length of the country. Speaking personally, I'll admit that this is probably my favorite portion of the book. I guess like in the context, probably the Italian stereotypes are actually pretty heavily politically loaded. But for whatever reason, they don't really bite like they used to. So what really shines through at the end for me is the fun. So I'll say, consider the following passage, in which Twain explains one of his gang's countless pranks to their tour guide who, quote, has shown us the great picture in the Sistine Chapel, the frescoes, enough to fresco the heavens, pretty much all done by Michelangelo. So with him we have played the great game which has vanquished so many tour guides for us, imbecility and idiotic questions, end quote. So when the tour guide shows them this bronze statue right here, Twain explains, we look at it indifferently, and the doctor says, by Michelangelo? And pardon me for this, but no, not know who. Then he shows us the ancient Roman Forum. The doctor asks, Michelangelo? A stare from the guide. No, 1,000 years before he is born. Then an Egyptian obelisk. Again, Michelangelo. Oh, mon Dieu, gentlemen, this is 2,000 years before he is born. He grows so tired of that unceasing question that he dreads to show us anything at all. The wretch has tried all the ways he can think of to make us comprehend that Michelangelo is only responsible for the creation of part of the world. But somehow he has not succeeded yet. Relief for overtasked eyes and brain from the study and sightseeing is necessary, or we shall become idiotic sure enough. Therefore, the guide must continue to suffer. If he does not enjoy it, so much the worse for him, we do. My sense is that that final we is doing a lot of work in making Twain's humor not just funny and not just political, however it happens to be political, but functional. Who is included in that we? Well, of course, Twain and his companions. But also, I contend, I think pretty plausibly, all of us reading it. The structure of the joke, after all, relies on a nested irony. A verbal irony, the doctor does not actually believe that Michelangelo is responsible for the creation of the whole world, within a dramatic irony. The joke is funny because, the Italian stereotypes, right? But even more importantly, because we, all of us, the audience, understand what the tour guide does not, that the doctor is merely teasing him. The same irony that makes the joke funny has the added pleasure of bringing us into the fold. Just like Twain and his buddies, we are in on the joke. I'd argue that this is the sort of maneuver that accounts for the immense success of The Innocents Abroad. In the 19th century, travelogues come a dime a dozen. The fun of reading this novel, this travelogue, is not that you get to imagine seeing new places, but that you get to imagine hanging out with the Quaker City gang. But what would it actually mean to hang out with Mark Twain? Innocents Abroad posits a relationship between Twain and his audience. Posits a relationship between Twain and his audience. Reading the novel is structurally interpersonal. But it is only in or through the novel that this interpersonal connection can exist. The Twain persona, after all, was the person of Samuel Clemens, but as critics like Judith Ross Lee have remarked, it is not only that. Twain was a person, but he is also a pen name and a public performance, and yes, indeed, a business enterprise. Moreover, the actual activity of hanging out with our new friend Mark Twain, unlike hanging out with, for example, human Samuel Clemens, is inescapably mediated. Strictly speaking, Mark Twain does not exist except in the text, performances, and branded merchandise that, to be perceived and interacted with, must be consumed. Probably, for Twain fans in the 19th century, there would have been nothing particularly mysterious about this. One's association with Twain was unremarkably a matter of commodity consumption. In the context of The Innocents Abroad, there seems to be no more perfect encapsulation of this awareness than the fact that in 1888, The Innocents Abroad was turned into a board game called Innocents Abroad, published by Parker Brothers, sending players on the journey of the Quaker City, abstracted to avoid litigation, complete with what seemed to be opaque references to the novel, trip to the railroad dining room, and instructions to interact with one's friend. And I don't know, in a lot of ways, this talk just sort of sprang from the fact that I think this is nuts, right? It's sort of me just justifying, can we talk about how crazy this is? But anyway, there it is, clear as day. By purchasing the game, players can simulate the experience of traveling the world with their good friend Mark Twain. Such consumption enables and indeed conditions friendship with Mark Twain. And thus, in a philosophically pragmatist sense, as consumption makes Mark Twain socially perceptible, it is through consumption that Mark Twain becomes real. This may be a rather uneasy note to wind down on. I have suggested that through consumption, Mark Twain comes to life, imbuing commodity goods with personality distinct from that of Samuel Clemens, to say nothing of the physical labor ultimately at the bottom of such commodities, board games or books or cigars or clean and furnished theaters. In the crass language of Marxist political economy, what I have described is merely the commodity fetish. Again, to be clear, none of this is to discount the politics of Twain's humor. But still, one plausible, last page, summary of this talk may simply be that Twain's humor is an engine of commodity fetishism. And indeed, in modern advertising, success more or less amounts to reverse engineering what Twain did seemingly on accident for himself, on purpose for things like cars and yogurt. The point is to make the prevailing feature of a given commodity, not its actual features, and God, absolutely not where it's come from, but its personality, right? Like, what is the personality of your Kia, right? If that's the thing that you think about with your Kia, then the advertisement has succeeded. In such a discursive economic landscape, to consume a commodity is not fully separable from having a kind of relationship with the abstract person for which the commodity stands. But then two things can be true at once, and that's the last note that I'll end on. I mean, on one hand, we have commodity fetishism, and that's awful and exploitative and so on. But it may be that, and it may well be that one of the functional consequences of Twain's humor is to reify these soulless clumps of capital while alienating human people from other real human people. But on the other hand, I'm not sure that we need to swipe down commodity-mediated sociality as a matter of course, because we do get political power from Twain's work. And at the end of the day, after all, I can't imagine that any of us would be here in this barn if we did not also think that there was something important, something still worth having about that abstract Twain persona. So that's it. Thank you very much.